celebrate the publication of The Boy Who Could Change the World, the Writings of Aaron Swartz. Let me just say a word or two about Civic Hall first, and then also about the other sponsors of tonight's event, and then we'll dive right in. So first of all, Civic Hall, we are almost 1 year old. We opened our doors February at the beginning of 2015. And the idea here is that Civic Hall is a collaborative community center for people working in civic tech and innovation. And to us, civic tech is any form of technology used for the public good. And you are in our event space. We have events here all the time. In fact, over the last year, I think we've had at least one event a day, and more than 20,000 people have been here for events like this. On the other side of the space, which you're welcome to wander through on your way out, though it closes at 7 o'clock, is a big collaborative community workspace. We have nearly 900 members, individuals as well as organizations that join, that pay different rates depending on how much they use the space, and it is a place where you can come and work and network and collaborate on meaningful projects like the kinds of things I'm sure that Aaron would have been involved in if he were still with us today. A word about our other sponsors. I should say thank you as well to the New York Tech Meetup. Jessica Lawrence over there, the executive director, wave hello. Good friends, the New York Tech Meetup. If you aren't signed up already, there's still room. You can join the nearly 50,000 people who belong to the New York Tech Meetup, which is the world's largest meetup. They have a monthly demo night at NYU, which sells out instantly, but if you say hi to Jessica, maybe she can get you in. And also to New York Tech and Eric Grimmelman back there, thank you also as well for sponsoring. Great to have you here. And then lastly, I should say to the New Press. I don't know if everybody here knows about the New Press, but it is now in its 25th year as an independent nonprofit publishing house, a really venerable one that publishes all kinds of great books and authors. It's wonderful tonight for them to be here celebrating the publication of this new book. And I want to tell you that just here and tonight, if you want to buy more copies of Aaron's book, it is only $10, which is even cheaper than what you would pay if you got it from that company in Seattle. So welcome. So here's how we're going to do the evening. I think we're going to start out, each of us, by saying a few words about just our connection to Aaron and what we're doing, why us now to talk about this book and his writings. And I'm going to also ask each of our speakers, after some introductory remarks, to talk a bit about the big ideas that he was wrestling with and promoting. But the goal is to have a conversation and invite you in. And so I'm hoping that at least half of the evening there'll be time for questions and dialogue. And hopefully we'll have everybody done before 8 o'clock, and there'll be time to have a little more wine and make sure to finish all the nice food that's out there. So I'm just going to, using the moderator's prerogative, say a few words first about my own relationship to Aaron. I met Aaron, I guess when he must have only been, I think, 16. I haven't actually sat down and done the math, but I met him in, I think it was the fall of 2004 in San Francisco, and I was at a hackathon run by a company called Technorati, which happened to be started by my smarter little brother David. And Technorati, for people here remember what Technorati was? But back in the day when blogs were the big thing, Technorati was the search engine for blogs. And they invited a bunch of developers in to come build on top of their API. And I happened to be visiting, and I had this thought, gee, wouldn't it be cool if we could see how many people were blogging about members of Congress. Maybe we could even put some heat on members of Congress if they knew that lots of bloggers were talking about them, right? So we had this idea, and this is right after we had started Personal Democracy Forum, our conference about tech and politics, and we were beginning to start our own blog covering that. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if there was like an index that showed you which politicians were hot in the blogs? Like maybe they'd be a little more accountable to the people because of that. And so I went to this thing with nothing more than this notion that maybe somebody could build this. And at the beginning of the evening, before everybody got started and kind of grouped themselves into whatever projects they wanted to do, I stood up and I said, I know this may sound weird, but I have $100 in my pocket, which I will give to anybody here if you can just build me this index, like who are the top politicians in the blogs right now, in the House and in the Senate. And other people pitched their ideas, and everybody got to work. And this scrawny kid came over to me and he said, I think I can do your idea. And that was Aaron. And he proceeded to go sit and work, and about an hour and a half later he came over to me with a perfectly good piece of running code, which we then implemented. And I parted with my $100, and that was the beginning of a really lovely friendship. But that was Aaron in essence, and it's not really elevated that much in the book, but people may not know how many people he built websites for, how many people he just knew how to do this. And this is in a day before we had the field that we have now, where there are people who are not just technologists, but who are also working on political problems and combining those skills together. And he was just really, really early in understanding that he had a special set of skills and he could use them for social change. And I will always cherish that memory. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panel. And I guess I'll start with introductions, and then I'll hand it over first to Zephyr. But we have with us tonight Zephyr Teachout, who I'm sure all of you may know, especially if you're New Yorkers and voted in the last gubernatorial primary here. Zephyr is a newly minted candidate for Congress, tonight speaking in a civic capacity, and also a law professor at Fordham. To her right, we have David Auerbach, who writes for Slate magazine and is a contributor to this book, and writes the Bitwise column. And then lastly, further on, is Jed Bickman, who is an associate editor at the New Press and worked on the publication of the book. So I hand it off to you, Zephyr. Tell us about your relationship to Aaron and to his ideas about change.
Do you want me to talk about both?
No, start just with the first.
And then we'll come around again? Okay. I suspect there are a lot of people in this room who had a relationship with Aaron the way I did. It felt very special and intimate and important to me, but he had a capacity to have these incredibly intense, close intellectual relationships with a lot of people that were sporadic. I think I met him in 2007, although I haven't quite figured out. I do remember that he blogged the day after he met me that I wasn't nearly as bad as he thought, or had heard. We had a wonderful long conversation about free will and about whether or not we could do a crowdsourced April Fool's Day joke where everybody got the same template of a large duck foot and planted a duck walking across America on April 1st. And in fact, we reserved the website giganticduck.com. It never happened, but that was the beginning of my friendship with Aaron. And then I was just reading over some old emails. This is Aaron and Larry Lessig and Japhet and I scheming about, we got to start a new organization. So Aaron says, I think this should be on the front page. Fed up with politicians ignoring your opinions and listening instead to lobbyists and special interests? Enough is enough. It's time to take our Congress back. We're building a movement of citizens like you to force Congress to change its ways, but we can't do it without your help. Will you join us? And then there's a back and forth and some discussion, well, maybe we should just focus on Congress members and not on the public at large. And Aaron writes, well, the question is, do we say we use a third of Congress to persuade 100,000 people to fight for change, or do we use 100,000 people to persuade a third of Congress to fight for change? Also, he adds, knowing the charisma of the average congressperson, it seems more likely to me that a campaign of citizens is going to inspire a congressperson to do something than a bunch of congresspeople are going to inspire citizens to do something. And then we were sporadic, close friends. I spent about a month in Cambridge once, and we would meet at Pete's Coffee, and he would give me notes on Keynes, the economist. And some of his blog writing was sort of extensively about economic policy, and I found him incredibly insightful there. So you were asking earlier how I knew him, and I feel like he was sort of at the edge and at the center of so many different things I was doing. I was on the board of Fight for the Future, which was a real leader in the SOPA PIPA fight. But it was often just a sort of late night or middle of the day instant message full of a really profound, exciting idea. And after he passed, Tiffany, who I knew, I really did love him. We started an organization that Tiffany led on about supporting a small business economy and breaking up big banks. And we were like, oh, let's look at the website, breakupbigbanks.com, and we found that Aaron had previously purchased it. Thanks.
So I didn't know Aaron, and it's funny because I knew people who knew him. His name kept coming up. You would see, so he was this sort of figure who was, everywhere, and yet, I was sort of in the engine room of things. I was working as sort of a servers engineer at Microsoft and Google. And in some ways, he was an inspirational figure in that I made the decision that he made, and he describes it in the book at one point as depriving the world of a great programmer in favor of a mediocre writer. And I tell myself, well, I'm not that great of a programmer, so it's okay in my case. But when reading him, there are, if you work amongst engineers, if you work among computer scientists, it is a very nice world in which to forget about how incredibly inconvenient and frustrating most of the world is. One thing I say now, after I stopped being an engineer, I currently write for Slate, and I say, I will never encounter sort of a situation as sort of rational and sort of as objectively goal-defined in which a number of people shared, an objectively definable goal quite as clearly as I did when I was the years at Google, at least. And this is because I worked at servers, so I wasn't even facing users. I was facing other engineers. So the only people who ever asked anything of me were engineers, and they knew how to ask for things, And it's wonderful, but it's also, sort of, the things that, the issue of, being disconnected from the mechanisms that make most of the world go around. And you can see how Aaron wanted to join those two worlds, that he believed that, that the benefits of technology, and he saw them as, I think, very fundamentally connected to the nature of sort of large-scale networking and large-scale decentralization. These benefits could be and should be brought to everyone and should not be the reserve of some sort of tech elite or some sort of, sort of clique of people who are in the know, which, I think even into the 2000s they are. And I think that, now we're seeing, we are seeing that change, and we're seeing some of the issues of that change. And it makes me sorry that he's not around, because I really think he would be a voice against some of the more, revanchist attitudes these days, saying, well, basically we just need to shut down all these underclasses that have made their way onto the internet and just sort of ignore them, and sort of, something I see just in terms of being in a tech columnist is, people talking about, we need to shut down like comments on magazine articles. They're no good. The hoi polloi come in and mess up everything. I was thinking about this just today because my column this week was on sort of how to fix Twitter, because people seem to feel that Twitter is a pretty unpleasant experience these days. And I said that the nice thing is that it makes for these happy accidents that you don't get in more of a walled garden like Facebook. The problem is that it comes with a surfeit of unhappy accidents. And I think that, Aaron's idealism really sort of talked about the need for those happy accidents, and how the alternative to those happy accidents is a much more authoritarian framework. And I think that central to that, he talks about the needs for sort of masses, but he also was very insistent on dissent, and he was a very good dissenter. And I remember running across his Amazon book reviews, some of which are in here. Some of the nastiest ones didn't make it into the book, so you should definitely look online and find the others. Here's one that didn't make it into the book that I always go back to. This is of the book The Wisdom of Crowds, and he says, one thing the book does teach, although not clearly, is the wisdom of dissent. You can ensure dissent by collecting a large group and keeping the members from talking to each other, since people are usually smart but afraid of going against the grain, by ensuring some members of the group vocally disagree, since they will force the others to better justify their positions, or by forcing them to try to justify all sides, since that will keep them from prejudging the question. All of which makes it ironic that the book fails because of a lack of dissent. Nothing goes against the grain, he doesn't justify his positions, and he has clearly prejudged the question. He assumes he is right and only stops to look down upon those who disagree. And, that's something I ask myself and say, look, to what extent are you doing this? It's also something I look at other people and say, to what extent are you doing this? And then I write about them in the column. But, I do try to ask it of myself as well. And I think that restlessness, that impatience, that dissatisfaction, in combination with a great deal of idealism, is something that is hard to hold on to, and I think that I read this and I feel like, well, at least no, there's no question of giving it up, and so that's what Aaron means to me.
So I also didn't know Aaron. I followed his blog and knew him as an activist and a writer, so the reason I wanted to do this book is because I knew him as a thinker and a writer about an incredibly diverse array of things, and as an activist. And as soon as he died, I felt that his story changed. The narrative we tell about him is not even close to resembling what he would say about himself given the chance. And so, what he thought was important was not himself. And I just wanted to bring that back into the discourse and highlight the idealism and the incredible array of thinking that he did. So that's why I really wanted to push to do this book. At first, when I started out, I was a little bit worried about the fact that he didn't write about the case that led to his death. I thought that maybe that was something that people would want to read about. then I very quickly realized that if he didn't write about it, then it's not what he wanted to say to the world. And that as a nonprofit publisher, I didn't really need to care that much about that. So I just want to make sure I've got a few notes. I don't overlook things. So when you sit down to do a book that restores the voice of somebody who writes about such an incredible array of things and sees the world with such idealistic clarity that Aaron did, you face a sort of interesting editorial problem. I don't know if you guys are interested in the minutia of editing the book, but I'm going to go into it. The question is, he clearly didn't see his writing as a diverse body of thought, as a cohesive body of thought. He didn't see it together between two covers. So do you organize it chronologically or do you organize it thematically? And reviewing the book in the New Republic, actually, the reviewer made a pretty good argument, I thought, for starting the book with his earliest thinking and his earliest writing, which was mostly about school and a critique of structured school and the history of school. And he made the argument, Malcolm Harris, sorry, that was the name that was blinking. That sort of defiance of authority structured Aaron's thinking in his life. I thought about doing that, but I realized that structuring the book in sort of a chronological way would foreground his earliest and his most juvenile writing. And he was really a boy genius. He was a brilliant writer, a brilliant thinker at an incredibly young age. But he did also change and mature. And I didn't think that he would want his sort of earliest thoughts to also be the most prominent in the book. So I organized it thematically, which was itself a challenge because he didn't organize his thinking that way. He would get deeply interested in one question at a time, do a deep dive, and put it out into the world as a unit. I admit that there are some pieces that got orphaned out, that couldn't be categorized into a part about one thing. I'm really pleased that we have this panel to think about his writing. Sorry, this is much less eloquent and much less practice. Usually behind the screen.
You have to get practice somewhere.
Yeah, you have to get practice somehow. I usually support my authors, and in this case, we sadly don't have him with us. But I'm pleased that we have this panel to foreground his thinking about his ideas rather than that exist about him.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it too. It's also true that his blog is still up. So, one really nice thing here is this can be a entryway into a much richer, archive of writing that people can dip into. So I wanted to ask each of you, if you would, because I think what we really want to focus on is to look forward and to think about, what in Aaron's thinking do you think, for our audience and beyond, what's one big idea that he was either wrestling with or promoting that you think is in that category of could change the world, deserves more attention, which really speak to you? And I don't know what anybody's going to say, so hopefully you don't all say the same thing. But take it in any order. Who wants to go first?
I'll start. I haven't had a chance to read the book, and I'm really excited to have it. So this idea, I was just flipping through to figure it out, and you can tell me, but I don't think this is in here, and I don't know how much he was writing about it, except in discussing Keynes, although there's elements in here and hints and sort of feints at the Gilded Age, the last Gilded Age. But I do think that Aaron in the post-crash era, sort of post-2008, was among the real visionaries who saw that what was happening in the cable industry and what was happening in the banking industry were deeply, deeply connected. And we still have a tendency to think, to speak politically, and one of the, this isn't an idea, it's just something I deeply admire, is that Aaron was constantly engaged, not just in organizations or in thinking, but actually in campaigns, working on campaigns themselves. I brought him to a Harvard class once, which was sort of a wonderful, sorry, this is a little story and then I'll give the answer. Just a really fun experiment where all the students in the class were learning online organizing. And they would throw their hypo at Aaron and he would come up with a really interesting campaign to promote the online organizing of their particular thing. My favorite was putting the mouth back into medical education. And a whole campaign around that. But he had all these ideas that were, I thought, quite amazing. But one of the things that we often see is we'll see Al Franken's work or the Comcast net neutrality fight as one category. That's where the techies are going. That's the responsibility of those who have expertise in that area. And then Elizabeth Warren has expertise in banking, so she'll deal with the banking questions and address excess or illegitimate power in that sphere. And because we see these as separate, then there's less power, first of all, in those 100,000 citizens, which are the citizens that Aaron has always cared about. And he was pushing that and pushing me and pushing people around us to see differently, to see big banks and big cable in a similar way. I know that's had a big impact on me personally, and I actually think we're starting to see that way of seeing, which again has references back to the Gilded Age more broadly in the culture. That's the negative side of it. The positive side of it is this very deep vision that you've already talked about, which is that decentralized power isn't just a sentence, it's actually a possible future. And that decentralized power can exist in banking as it can in within a well-architected internet.
That's actually perfect lead into what I was going to say. So thank you. For me, the most important idea I think that I've taken away from it is to what extent can technology, network technology, allow anarchism and anarchic ideas to scale in a way that, historically they never appear to have done so. And there's a technical piece actually that I think I'm really glad was in the book, that I think is a great example of this, where he talks about using the blockchain technology of Bitcoin in order to have a decentralized DNS. And DNS is the domain name service for the internet, that when you look up a website address, it gives you the IP so that you can actually contact that website. And the top level, DNS servers are controlled by a shadowy government cabal called ICANN. But ICANN is one more, supernatural national organization. You thought I said supernatural? Yeah. The X-Files is back. Yes. It's like the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, all of those. MK Ultra, yes. ICANN is, a bureaucratic organization, and it is subject to the same pressures of any large organization that controls the distribution of information. And so it is seen, especially by the more anarchy-oriented of hackers as a real single point of failure in a way that I think little else is. And here is, just in the middle that he came up with in 2000, what is the date from? Like 6 or 7 years ago, this idea to say, okay, look, can we do without, any sort of centralized domain authority whatsoever? And the key there is not necessarily even this example specifically, but that we have the problem of coordination among masses. And how do you coordinate among masses without either generating chaos or generating tyranny? And, and I think, historically the thought has been to go back to, Federalist 10, Federalist 51, and say, okay, look, yeah, we have to deal with it, and therefore democracy bad. And isn't that more or less that's what I hear every time I ever hear anyone talking about anyone talking about politics. And I think the thing here is that
Circles.
do we? Oh, what circles are? Okay.
There's more optimism in 10 and 51 than
Oh well, but it is nonetheless. It is an anti-direct democracy. It's like okay, is it an argument against direct democracy? And if you look through, you will see pretty consistently, I think, in Aaron's writings, not wholly consistently, and this was something I was talking about Micah earlier, which is that if there's a criticism I have of his political orientation, it's that I don't think it's quite as easy to square Noam Chomsky and John Maynard Keynes as he seems to think it is. But there's an optimism towards this ideal of direct democracy, a way in which sort of the will of the people can be transparent and in a way that even verges on like Rousseau at times, and even if we say that that's not realistic, I think it's very good to ask to what extent technology is enabling new means of coordination that may allow for additional decentralization that is not sort of what we associate as neoliberal. Now, how many of you here have read James Scott's Seeing Like a State? I thought this was like the biggest book of the last. All right. Okay, so I won't invoke it in that case. But that
We're at a book event. You can go ahead.
Well, no, it just we think of neoliberalism as I guess it depends. Actually, here, how about this? How many? Can I have a show of hands and say how many people hear neoliberalism and think good? Okay, how many people hear neoliberalism and think bad? How many people hear neoliberalism and think somewhere in the middle? Okay, so we got overwhelming vote for bad side, but we have to remember that here he's endorsing Paul Krugman, who is founding neoliberal member, and so that the question, the challenge that is posed here is to what extent can the decentralization aspect of neoliberalism, in other words, doing without the sort of centralized planning that indeed even a great deal of Keynesian economics and redistribution would require, can allow us to get at the sort of non-laissez-faire mechanisms without the dangers of central planning and the tyranny that we're all familiar with. And I think that honestly is probably the biggest and the most important idea that I think Aaron has raised. I just do not, and it takes, I think, such a technical familiarity with what technology is capable with that I think we're only really beginning to see sort of the origins of that kind of thought.
I think my thought is more methodological, and it's comes from the accumulation of everything that he did and wrote. We've said the phrase "way of seeing" a couple times already on this panel, and for me, that is what was most powerful. Is that he taught you through his writing how to see the world as fixable in a way that I've never seen before in my life, and it was truly inspiring. Agreed, sometimes it was a little bit too simplistic, but he had the courage to believe that there could be simple answers. He saw the complexity of problems, but still believed that there could be simple answers to them. And he understood how difficult political action was and political campaigns were, but he still felt that the world was fixable in a really fundamental way, and in a way that totally resisted ideological labels, and the willingness to take good ideas from thinkers as diverse as Paul Krugman, Noam Chomsky, and Keynes, really illustrates a sort of hacker sensibility to the world that extends, and it doesn't matter what level or what regime. This is true of the biggest political questions of our age, but it's also true of our interpersonal interactions. How can we fix the way that we make small talk? How can we fix the way that we talk about culture in an inclusive way? How can we fix our diets? This was a huge question for him. So that sort of life hacking that he did in a personal way, which I did choose to leave out of the book at his family's request, but the belief that the world could be better in the smallest ways and in the biggest ways, and all we have to do is see those simple answers. Sounds a little bit like a motivational poster, but he made me internalize it in a way that was absolutely revelatory for me.
I'll just add 2 cents to this, because reading through the book, to me the most inspiring part, interestingly, is the last chapter where he talks about his attitudes towards education and schooling, which, as you just said, you chose not to put at the beginning, but to save, because I think Aaron, as a independent, self-educated person who, very early on rebelled against structured learning and dropped out of Stanford. And basically, when he got interested in the subject, he figured out how to go learn about it. I don't know whose phone that is, but it's not mine. Please silence your cell phones. That he would literally even reach out to whoever the expert was and say, can I come learn with you? And they would take the time to, talk to him. And that willingness to sort of just ignore the rules, make his own path, to me, I think is, the most inspiring piece. And it's really, there are two, the book better than me, but it struck me that there are two parts of the book where there are incredibly long expositions that were not like blog pieces, but were like full-on either transcripts of talks he gave, or in one case it's a paper he wrote for a Stanford class. So there's one about, it's basically Aaron dissecting everything he had learned about how lawmaking and influence actually works, and which he, I think, wrote for one of his Stanford professors. And then there's this very long, eloquent talk he gave about unschooling and education near the end, and both of those are really beyond the basic level of blogginess that some of the rest of the book has. I want to open it up. I mean, there are people here who actually, I know who also probably knew Aaron too, so it's okay if you want to share a story, but also questions for our panel or comments about his ideas. I mean, they really did range widely from the mechanics of Wikipedia to the ethics of file sharing and violating copyright, to thinking about how we fix our democracy, as well as economic reform. So there really is a lot to draw on, but I do want to include the audience. So raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. Do we have mics to hand people? Run a mic. Take my mic. If you have a statement, please phrase it in the form of a question.
You have to speak up. I got your microphone now. I haven't read the book myself yet either. I just got it tonight. Thank you very much.
Tell us your name.
I'm Chaz Antonelli. I'm old school hacker. And I didn't find out about Aaron until it was too late, unfortunately. And I've known many people like Aaron throughout my life. And my big question to everybody is, what can we do, anyone in this room, to prevent this kind of situation from happening again? How can we encourage people like Aaron to be able to share this information, share their belief systems, and not end up getting in trouble like he did? I know of people that are currently doing time in jail because they bucked the system, and I think that's just terrible. So I'd like to know what your opinion is of how we can do, what we can do to fix this. Thank you.
Say something that's maybe not quite an answer to the question. You know, I think I alluded to before, I find the situation that ended his life to be absolutely baffling. And I don't think I'm ever going to resolve that. And so because of that, I don't have a direct answer to that question of how we can prevent that again. I will say that it's important to remember that this happened to somebody who really had everything going for him in the world, and he faced the weight of the criminal justice system, and it destroyed him. And that there are thousands and thousands of people every day who face the same system, who don't have the resources or the friend network or the intelligence, even sometimes, you know, not all the time, that Aaron did. And I think that one thing that we can carry forward is just a sense of empathy and acknowledgement of you know, the real weight of that system and how it works. And I'm speaking sort of narrowly about the criminal justice system, but also broadly about what it takes to face power in that way.
Yeah, it's funny. I was at a cybersecurity event the other week, and there was someone from the government there, and he sort of made reference to, oh, well, you know, we, you know, don't enforce, you know, we aren't ridiculous in enforcing these laws. And he sort of made reference to, you know, I know that you could point to one or two cases, and it was, you know, but it was clear that he was sort of, you know, sort of alluding to Aaron's case and sort of saying, look, we learned our lesson or whatever. And I think that what we can do to some extent is to be vigilant. I mean, even now, I think it's not quite sort of clear that, you know, the reason it wasn't the JSTOR thing specifically that got him in trouble, but the Pacer thing. And after he took all the material from Pacer and the government tried to get him on it and couldn't, they were sort of out to get him after that. And the JSTOR thing sort of led them to throw the book at him on what should have been, you know, a minor charge. And, you know, and I think that, you know, I mean, to the extent that it relates to the issues he's concerned with, I think it does relate to, you know, issues of centralization of power and the fact that basically, you know, his actions in what one would think of as a very different domain of Pacer would actually then have a consequence in this, you know, seemingly much less consequential area when he went into a closet and like took down a bunch of articles that no one reads anyway. And I think that the best that can be done there is to, I think, you know, be really vigilant in terms of, you know, what is actually going on in terms of law enforcement practices, not just in terms of legislation. I mean, it's funny because, you know, you can read something, you know, where he says like, everybody's pirating music, therefore it should be legal, or something like that. It's very cavalier. This is like from 2003 or something. But you know, the gap between, you know, so much of that discussion seems to have gone underground because I guess it's been flooded by, you know, louder and more superficial discussion that people sometimes forget that it is still going on, and that you have things around Tor and you have things around issues of proxies and things like that. And the future of, you know, what we know of as the internet is still at stake. The transition to mobile, I think, in general, has not been a great thing for, you know, internet freedom as we know it. I don't think, you know, the dominance of, you know, a number of corporate-owned networks is great as we know it either. So what can we do? We can try to, you know, exert whatever control we can in terms of steering that in a direction that is less centralized and allows for less abuses of power, not because, you know, we're not because we necessarily are cynical and think those abuses of power, will happen because of X, Y, or Z, but because structures produce certain abuses. And if you can come up with a structure that tends to prevent it, you're going to be better off. That's the best I can do. Sorry, that's a hard question.
So I'm going to take your question quite literally, and I don't know what you're already doing, but one thing you could do is form a reading group, and in that reading group, a smaller reading group, I don't know what brings you here, you're involved in the tech community. Okay, great. To read both historically about the criminal justice system here, and about plea bargaining, and then also about the particular laws, and talk about it. So have a more full, this is a little too cute, but, I don't want to say Aaron would do that or anything, but try to get really a ground organizing and understanding. And then that group of you can then try to exercise political and media power. Because having tech voices in the criminal justice realm is extremely powerful. It's surprising. It's not a usual, and you wouldn't be alone, but you would be joining one of the 100,000 people. So I would think of it as a deep learning, which then grounds activism.
So taking off my moderator hat for 1 second, I appreciate you asking that question. I want to add 2 additional ideas to the mix. The first one is we also need to work to destigmatize mental illness and depression. This is not a shameful thing. It's a disease of the brain. And getting help is good. It's not something that people should feel they have to hide. And I think that's true across society. The tech sector is not, any different in people hiding that. And that's one. And then the other is, personally, this is me just expressing my view here. If there is a way for us to diminish the myth of the hacker hero who somehow by himself takes on the powers that be, saving the world. We have a lot of them. Julian Assange and so on. It's a very powerful narrative. It's seductive. And sometimes it works. Dan Ellsberg being a wonderful example, though nobody is alone in these fights. And in fact, power is a collective act. And so I would say, don't teach our children to be, to think that path is a good path. It's not the best path. Maybe it's too hard. So all those circumstances together, if we can somehow shift that, maybe we won't have these kinds of tragedies happen as often. I'd like to see that happen. Other questions, other comments? Yeah, somebody all the way in the back there.
Yeah, so I'm kind of...
Yeah.
Hi, so I am a newcomer to the Civic Hall, and I'm glad I learned about it. My question is somehow related to the first question. What do you feel are other organizational structures which could support people who kind of pursue activism in broad of civic disciplines? So, I don't know, other forums,
So you just sort of ran that, I'm going to get my metaphor messed up, baseball right across the line, and I'm going to take a swing at it. Civic Hall is such an important center, not just of this technical interchange of really smart people who care about the public good exchanging really good strategic ideas. It is actually an embodiment of that vision that Micah just laid out, that the political vision that if we are going to achieve the public good, it requires community. So it's an easy answer here, but it's a really important one. Bring people here, have meetings here. You can find an incredible community here, and I think there's a possibility for even more community in the first year. Has it been yet?
Yeah, and I would add to that, I mean, an organization that's connected to this is New America, where I'm a fellow, and I mean, I think they have also been bringing together a lot of people who've been, you know, for just sort of cross-fertilization of policy-oriented ideas in a vaguely nonpartisan, though mysteriously somewhat left-slanting way. Maybe I'm not supposed to actually say that, but. Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, in a different way, more generally speaking, I think I've gotten, I think, as much, if not more, from ad hoc assemblages of both of the living and the dead. I try to read, you know, Jakob Burckhardt said that if you, you know, a person can only be an expert in one field, but if you are not an amateur in as many other fields as possible, you are doomed to be a barbarian. And I think it is that, you know, you run this risk, and you see this, you know, how many books do we have come out where, you know, genius mind X of this field says, I am now going to explain the entire world in terms of this field. I understand everything, and it clearly boils down to the field I've been working in, you know. I trust me on this one. It's my field. It's not the others. And I think that doing anything to basically compensate for that, you know, I was acutely aware of this when I was, you know, sort of doing graduate classes in like literature and philosophy while I was programming at Google, and sort of aware that, you know, like it's like walking into speaking a different culture, different language, you know, no shared assumptions. That was very good. And still, you know, I do not get sucked into any monoculture, and that includes the monocultures of Twitter and Facebook, and, you know, and absolutely talk to the worst off of society, find some way to do it. Talk to people who have no voice in society. There are a lot of them. They really need a voice, and if they don't have one, you'll have to at least give it to them on a, you know, case-by-case basis.
While we're talking about organizations, just quickly, one of the other contributors to this book is David Siegel, who is here tonight. I'm not sure if he's still around. Yeah, there he is in the back. He started with Aaron an organization called Demand Progress, which is still up and running. So if you want to specifically and concretely work on the projects that Aaron started during his life, and you know, extrapolating forward, get involved with him. I don't know if we want to say anything about it, but.
I don't have a quick pitch, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah.
Happy to talk to anybody afterwards.
Hi, I'm Larry Rudolph. I didn't know Aaron, but I was at MIT when he was there, and you know, I knew everyone who knew him, and like. My question is sort of the antithesis of saying that technology can solve all the problems. It looks to me now that there's this growing feeling that technology actually caused a lot of the problems, right? I mean, the fact that there's so much security, that you can do face recognition, that we have no privacy is sort of, as a computer scientist for my whole life, I feel guilty of the fact that I've worked so hard to make our lives so miserable. And you know, a lot of the abuses that we see today is really due to our efforts as computer scientists and not thinking about the problems that we're working on. And I was just wondering whether Aaron actually saw any hints of that in his writings or works.
I don't think that Aaron saw quite clearly early on that the internet could be a very powerful tool. And he understood also that tools are neutral. And I think that he was worried, as David was talking about, he was excited about the internet because of its potential for decentralization, but he was clear-eyed about its potential to be taken over as sort of corporate mouthpiece and corporate media that it's become today. I think that my personal opinion is that we have a worse internet now than when Aaron died, and it's because of this overall centralization of content and of. So I don't think that there's anything inherent in it that makes life sort of better or worse, but I do think that it is a powerful technology, not as powerful as some of the other technologies that have sort of revolutionized human history. Let's remember that we still haven't graduated from the internal combustion engine or fossil fuels. We're working on that now, but it's a lot harder. So I think it's just important to sort of keep the perspective, the historical narratives in the perspective, and realize that this is a part of our lives. There's nothing inherently good nor inherently bad about it, but we have to fight to keep it as a democratic space.
I'm in no position to do an exegesis, and I haven't read the book, but I will speak for myself, which is that I see both techno-utopianism and techno-dystopianism as deeply disempowering, because they both tell a story of a future that we don't really have a role in. They're basically predicting. And one of the things that I love in the voice that I have read in some of the blog posts and look forward is that it rejects the modern punditry. And there's something very dangerous, I think, about a punditry that disempowers people and instead looks at what is possible, both what is possible bad and possible good, as opposed to predicting at 51% likelihood, is this going to lead us to ills or bads? And I actually think I think most people understand that both techno-utopianism and dystopianism are not helpful, but it's worth reinforcing because they're tempting narratives, because both of them give you permission to not work.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such a big question. There's so many directions in which one can take it. I mean, I guess one thing, things have always been miserable, so, I'm not going to blame technology for it. I think I did want to add something, which is I think it's important, it's more than a tool. I think that, computers are a tool, but I think in terms of how it affects us in an everyday way, it's technology as a medium that I think we are really sort of experimenting with in terms of how it is negotiating communication between us. That on the one hand, you do have computers as data processing mechanisms, and that has changed the world in a great deal. But on the other hand, you also do have the new medium of interpersonal communication through network technology. And to the extent that you can separate those two things, it's the medium aspect that I think in some ways poses a greater challenge, because it poses a challenge to what it is, to us defining ourselves. And this is actually what I'm writing my book about, so I suppose this is what's on my mind. But when it comes to something like that, it's the questions of utopianism or dystopianism sort of become more relative in the sense that you're looking at, okay, what is it that we are trying to become? I mean, we can say that, okay, yeah, don't be nice, don't kill people, but, if, what would it be to live longer? What would it be to, to have lives that are regimented in large part by sort of machine learning networks. On some level, there's the question of how are we going to exert self-determination over the Henry Adams-like dynamo that is sort of spinning of its own accord right now. And I'm going to be flat out sort of fatalistic and say that I don't think we have all that much control over it as it is. It's going to keep going, and so this is why sort of anyone who says, oh yes, we've got to slow down technology and take a step back from it and really reassess yourself. Yeah, that's not going to happen. But the issue is can technology be developed in ways that we at least collectively have some sense of what it is that it's doing to us? And I mean that very directly, not what tool is it developing it into, but what is it changing us into?
Hi, my name's Colin. I learned of Aaron Swartz when I saw the news of his death. I was on Reddit. I was like a sophomore in college, and that's when I started going through all of his posts and like reading about him and Lawrence Lessig. And I just want to say one thing, just as a quick statement, he did is, we have this internet. I think we're kind of like in an infatuation period with it. It's like, wow, this is great. Like cat videos all the time. And we have this thing, but normally growing up, I graduated high school in like 2008, and the conversation was always between just Democrats and Republicans. And the fact that there's somebody applying this amazing thing, this like luminous thing of the internet to these problems, and just opened up this whole like well of inspiration for me. I'm not a programmer, but just as a person who's been like inspired, I think he's done a lot to kind of galvanize like a younger generation of people. Well, my question for you guys was, in terms of decentralization, it makes me think a lot of like version control in like GitHub, when you're taking different parts from different actors and using that to build software. And I was wondering if that could be ever used in the political environment.
Can you explain in a little more detail what you mean in terms of what would GitHub look like for politics?
We want decentralization, but we don't necessarily have any example in the political realm, especially, of how that would even work. And we said we have to move beyond like leaders. We have to move beyond like the hero narrative that he wanted to move beyond, like kind of. So the question is, what examples do we have to take from of decentralization? I think GitHub version control is like probably one of the best.
So actually, there's a really interesting essay in the book by Aaron that comes from a book that we published in 2008 called Rebooting Democracy. And the idea was we posed this question to 50 diverse thinkers and writers, including Newt Gingrich, actually. And we said, if the founding fathers and mothers, yeah, actually, he's a good person to ask that kind of question. We said if they had the internet when they were writing the Constitution, what might be different? Or, it was a thought experiment. What would you do differently now that we have these capacities? Because, we are a 21st century country still running itself according to, the ideas of a bunch of very, very dead people. And with very modest system changes over 200 and what years. And Aaron's idea was really interesting. Like a lot of his ideas, it was derivative. He had spotted this from somewhere and plucked it and decided to elevate it. But he said, the original representative system was like one member of the House to every 40,000, right? And in fact, not that many people had the right to vote back then, so the actual ratio between a representative and the number of people who voted in the first elections in the United States was as low. It was like 1 to 400. I mean, it was really intimate representative democracy. And Zephyr has written a whole book about how obsessed the founding generation was with the problem of corruption and the danger that our representatives would not be independent, that they would be corrupted, but they thought that intimate degree of representation would make that very hard. They couldn't imagine a world where, you could spend money on mass media and thus buy influence in people's districts. They'd be so close to their constituents. So Aaron's idea was to elevate something that is called parpolity, and the notion is basically a set of nested groups of representative bodies. So you would start with a very local group of, I think, 100 people who would meet, debate, and then elect one person to represent them, and then that one person would join with another 100 people from 100 of those initial groups, and that would be the next layer and the next layer and the next layer, and somehow, you'd end up with somewhat more of an accountable and democratic system. And what he didn't explain is how we could actually make that work. I wish he was here to say, well, why don't you write the software to enable that kind of nested representative system. So I think that this is a question that I certainly pay a lot of attention to, and I think it's an unfinished question. The internet and all the tools that we use now were not designed for democratic decision making. Nobody would use an email list or a wiki or a blog or a commenting platform to make a decision. We struggle with these tools because it's all that we have. There are, I think, a new generation of people who are building, who are looking for ways, whether it's GitHub maybe, or some other kinds of models to help large groups of people make decisions together. There's nothing that says we have to stay with the things that they thought were really good 250 years ago, except our own inability to think beyond the box that we're in. So I'm glad you're inspired, actually. I really appreciate hearing that. David, you want to say?
Yeah. So I think I understand better what you were getting at with your with the GitHub analogy. So thank you for explaining that, because I wasn't clear on it at first. So I want to address it in two respects. On the one hand, you have decentralization, as we're talking about. On the other hand, there's also the notion of pluralism. That what you're effectively saying is, okay, well, each person has a different copy, a different version of, let's say in this case, a political program, a civic program, some sort of things. And what happened, and the issue is, okay, how do you reconcile these conflicting pluralist visions? And I think that one of the reasons why I've gotten a little sick of the word pluralism is because everyone thinks it means everybody believes whatever they want and gets along happily. No, it means everybody believes what they want and then they hate each other because someone thinks something different than that. And that's what we're seeing on the internet, is that it makes it a lot harder to forget that huge swaths of the country believe things that you find repugnant. To extend the GitHub analogy, so okay, let's say you have a merge conflict. Well, that's what you were getting at, right? The merge conflict, right? So the merge conflict is, well, just as in programming, it takes you out of the automated process. There are no automatic resolution procedures beyond trivial ones for there's no code or set of instructions for resolving these conflicts. And if you buy into sort of the late thinking of John Rawls, there cannot be, that the ensconcement of any sort of automatic resolution program like that would constitute tyranny, because you're basically forcing people to adhere to one set of mechanisms for dealing with politics, and that's going to be skewed to one ideology or another. So the question then becomes, okay, well, at what point are you going to let decentralization obviate those problems by just saying, okay, look, they just never roll up? And to what extent are you going to try to get some sort of consensus into some sort of like Rousseau-like general will? And I think that that's the tension that ultimately falls out of this, that, you're dealing with the extent to which you can devolve power in an anarchic sort of way versus coordinate in a non-tyrannical way. And I guess that brings me full circle, but that's an art, not a science, and that's sort of the big political project now, I think.
You referred to a book that nobody else has read. I just want to make a lawyer joke. Is that okay? Basically, he's talking about Pearson versus Post. for the lawyers in the room. Okay. It's a old chestnut in property law where there's a conflict between the culture of farmers and the culture of huntsmen in who gets a fox that is being hunted, whether somebody can interfere and get that fox. And the culture of the huntsman is you cannot interfere, and the culture of the farmer is that you can interfere. And it's a sort of fundamental versioning question, I guess.
That sounds like it should be discussed further over beers. I'm going to take one more question and then make sure we do have time to finish the wine that's out there. Go ahead.
Okay, for a long time I've been interested in technology, helping with the decentralization of politics. So David, I wanted to follow up on your mentioning of blockchain. So this is for you or anybody else on the panel or anybody else in the audience. I'm Ron Suarez. In 2003, JSTOR was a client of mine. I was walking distance from them in Ann Arbor and helped them implement the Open Archives initiative so they could share data with people, ironically. But anyway, in 2004, my house was the Ann Arbor headquarters for the Howard Dean campaign, and that's when I first learned to hate the van system. We had to go around a second time for Kerry because the data that we collected we didn't have access to. So after Bernie Sanders was locked out of his own data, I registered openvoterdata.org, and it's only just beginning, but looking to use blockchain technology. And it's just right now a splash page that says, if you're the one walking door to door collecting the voter data, shouldn't you own a copy of it? And shouldn't you decide whom to share it with? And I think blockchain data can work to do that. That would enable from the grassroots people at the bottom to form together as they please rather than in a two-party system. To support candidates that they'd like to support. So I'd like to hear comments from the panel or anyone in the audience. And if anybody, I can't do this by myself, openvoterdata.org, anybody who...
I just want to say, I love that the last question we're hearing tonight is a perfect Aaron Swartzian idea. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, that is exactly the sort of thing I think you'd be interested in doing. And I mean, look at Van, you know, it's like, well, let me ask you a question. Why are people still using them? Why don't we have some creative destruction going on here, you know? No, I think that, you know, you might have an answer to that. Yeah. Yeah, you would know.
It's a short answer, but I think it explains a lot, is that people in politics are often sort of consumed with fear, and so they misperceive risk across the board. And so switching systems is seen as incredibly high risk, even when staying with the same system is seen as low risk when in fact it's high risk.
So yeah, I mean, it seems like it does, you know, some of these systems do await people getting involved in this sort of way, and you know, I can't. I covered the healthcare.gov fiasco and was just horrified at what I saw in terms of government contracting and government waste. So I mean, the dysfunction that goes on in terms of, ironically, you know, the total lack of coordination in terms of assembling software systems. You know, I'm well aware that I've been fortunate enough to see what really constitutes the best case scenarios. I mean, security is just a nightmare. I mean, you know, if we look at what happened last year at the OPM hack, you know, this is a simple, let's take a simpler problem than the voter registration data and say just basically keeping, you know, a database of government employee information from being completely hacked and stolen and having 22 million accounts classified, 22 million accounts compromised, including tons of classified data and personnel files. You know, where does one go about fixing that? Well, it doesn't seem like the federal government's doing a very good job. The problem I always, as I understand it, is, you know, how does one begin to inject oneself into fixing those problems if the people who own the problems don't want them fixed? And this gets to what Zephyr says, you know, and it seems Like, I don't know, did Aaron have a knack at sort of convincing people that he was the person to fix their problems? Maybe was it his charm? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a very charming person, so I'm not able to convince people to. Trust me. People don't ask me. People don't. People don't want me to rebuild it. They seem to think I might find something out and decide to just run with it instead. Maybe that's it. But no, I think that's the thing is that you have entrenched power systems. How do you bring it about? And that's why the importance of decentralization comes there. Is okay. Well, at least you have the potential for at least creative destruction type events. And but we're getting to the point where a company like Facebook and Twitter, leaving aside the government is something that's extremely hard to creatively destroy. Even these large companies are getting very hard to supplant because their networks are becoming so predominant, and so. While I think those technical solutions exist, for me at least, it seems like an ongoing problem and one that I don't understand. One I would love, Aaron and other people to answer is, how you basically get traction in terms of implementing these solutions, because the will certainly seems there. And I know people who've worked for, 18F, that's what's it called? 18F, the government startup organization, and have very good experiences, but it does seem that my sense, at least, is that they're sort of barely sort of just chipping away at a very, very large edifice.
Well, it's good that we leave on an unfinished note. It's an unfinished story. Buy the book. Wrestle with the same questions. It's $10 out at the door. And if you want to hear more about events at Civic Hall, go to civichall.org, sign up to be on our email list, and come on out and have a drink. We'll hang out and talk some more. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.